A man walks through Copenhagen, his pants uneven, his hair wild, his back slightly hunched. Children point and laugh. Adults whisper. This is 1846, and Soren Kierkegaard, one of the most brilliant minds Denmark has ever produced, has become a public joke. A satirical magazine has turned him into a cartoon character, and the city that once admired him now mocks him in the streets. He'll die 9 years later, at 42, mostly forgotten, his books gathering dust in storage. But those books would eventually reshape philosophy, inspire existentialism, and force us to confront questions about faith, anxiety, and what it means to be human that we're still wrestling with today. Yet understanding Kierkegaard requires understanding something deeply uncomfortable. This wasn't a man who discovered wisdom through calm contemplation. This was someone forged in psychological fire from birth, raised by a father who believed his entire family was cursed by God, who watched his siblings die one by one, who broke his own heart to save the woman he loved, and who spent his final years fighting a lonely war against the church he'd devoted his life to. His philosophy didn't come from abstract reasoning. It came from trying to survive what he called a demented childhood in a house haunted by guilt and death. Copenhagen, in 1813, was a city still reeling from catastrophe. The British had bombarded it 6 years earlier, destroying a third of the buildings and killing thousands. Denmark had sided with Napoleon, a decision that would cost them Norway and leave the nation bankrupt. Into this wounded city, on May 5th, 1813, Søren Kierkegaard was born. He was the seventh and final child of Michael Pedersen Kierkegaard and Anna Sørensdatter Lund Kierkegaard. His mother was 45, his father was 56. He would later call himself a child of old age, and that mattered more than you might think. The household at Nytorv II was prosperous but strange. Michael Kierkegaard had risen from absolute poverty in rural Jutland to become one of Copenhagen's wealthiest merchants. As a boy, he'd been so poor he tended sheep on the heath, cold and hungry and desperate. According to family legend, in a moment of rage and despair, young Michael had cursed God. That curse would haunt him for the rest of his life. He believed, with terrifying certainty, that God would punish him for that blasphemy by taking all his children before they reached the age of Christ's crucifixion. 34. None of them would live past 34. Arne Lund had been a maid in the household. Michael's first wife had died, and within a year he'd married Arne, who was already pregnant. The timeline was impossible to hide, and Michael carried that shame along with everything else. She was described as a nice little woman with an even and happy disposition, quiet and uneducated. She never appears in Søren's writings, at least not by name. His brother Peter later claimed that Søren preserved many of their mother's words in his books, hidden and unacknowledged. She was a ghost in her own home, present but invisible. Michael retired early from business to devote himself to raising his children, but this wasn't normal parental involvement. This was a man consumed by guilt and melancholy, convinced he'd damned his family, determined to prepare them for suffering. He was deeply religious, a Lutheran shaped by Moravian pietism, which emphasized Christ's agony and human sinfulness. He presented the cross to his children not as a symbol of hope, but as a preview of what truth costs. From the earliest age, Søren learned that righteousness meant suffering, that the world was ruled by lies and injustice, and that God's love came wrapped in torment. The household became a kind of theatre of melancholy. Michael had a powerful imagination, and he used it. He would take young Søren on imaginary walks through Copenhagen without leaving their sitting room, describing streets and shops and people in such vivid detail that the boy could see them. It was brilliant and disturbing, a father teaching his son that reality was negotiable, that imagination could replace experience, that the mind was both prison and escape. Then the deaths began. Søren's siblings started dying. One sister, then another, a brother, another brother. The curse seemed real. By the time Søren was 21, 5 of his 7 siblings were dead. Only he and his older brother Peter survived into adulthood. The household became a tomb where children were raised to expect death. Michael's melancholy deepened into something close to madness, and Soren absorbed it all, the guilt and the fear and the certainty that existence itself was punishment. Years later, Kierkegaard would write about his childhood with a shudder. He called it a demented upbringing. He described himself as a child dressed up as an old man, damaged by impressions given by that melancholy old man who had himself been crushed by them. Frightening. That's the word he used. His childhood was frightening, not because of physical abuse, but because of psychological intensity that no child should endure. He was being prepared not for life, but for suffering, taught that truth required sacrifice, that joy was suspect, that God's attention meant pain. From 1821 to 1830, Kierkegaard attended the School of Civic Virtue, one of Copenhagen's best schools. He studied Latin, Greek, and history. He excelled academically, particularly in Latin and history, though he struggled with Danish composition. The irony is sharp. This boy who couldn't write proper Danish essays would become one of the two great stylists of the Danish language, rivaling Hans Christian Andersen himself. But that transformation took years. His early work was dense with Germanic constructions and Latin phrases, showing off his education while hiding his voice. School was socially difficult. He was described as very conservative, someone who would honour the king, love the church, and respect the police. He got into frequent altercations with fellow students. He was ambivalent toward his teachers. Other boys teased him, and he learned to defend himself with caustic wit and psychological insight into people's weaknesses. He became skilled at verbal combat, at finding the exact words to wound. It was self-defense, but it shaped him. He learned that language was a weapon, that intelligence could be armor, that understanding people meant seeing their vulnerabilities. A description from his brother Peter's wedding in 1836 captures how others saw him. He was 23. Someone found his appearance almost comical. He had something irregular in his entire form and a strange coiffure. His hair rose almost 6 inches above his forehead into a tousled crest that gave him a strange, bewildered look. This is the image we need to hold. Not the serious philosopher of later portraits, but this odd young man with wild hair and irregular form, someone people found slightly ridiculous even as they recognized something unusual about him. In 1830, Kierkegaard enrolled at the University of Copenhagen to study theology. It was the expected path for someone of his background and intelligence. But like Hegel before him, whose system he would later demolish, Kierkegaard drifted from theology into philosophy and literature. He started desultorily, enjoying what he later called a relatively dissolute time. He tried to cut the figure of a dandy, spent money he didn't have, ran up debts his father reluctantly paid. He was trying on identities, testing versions of himself, exploring what it meant to be someone other than the melancholy child his father had created. The 1830s were his years of aspiration and confusion. He wanted to become part of Copenhagen's literary elite, centered around Professor J.L. Heiberg, the city's cultural gatekeeper. Heiberg was a playwright, philosopher, aesthetician, and journal publisher who had introduced Hegel's philosophy to Denmark. Getting Heiberg's approval meant acceptance into the intellectual aristocracy. Kierkegaard pursued that acceptance with the hunger of someone who'd been psychologically isolated his entire childhood. But something was fracturing inside. The relationship with his father was deteriorating. The faith he'd been raised in was becoming unbearable. At some point around 1835, when Kierkegaard was 22, something happened that he would later call the Great Earthquake. The details are unclear because he wrote about it only in fragments and rough drafts. But the essence seems to be that he discovered or understood something about his father that shook his entire world. Perhaps he learned about his father's curse of God. Perhaps he understood the circumstances of his parents' marriage. Perhaps he simply saw clearly, for the first time, that his father's religion was built on guilt and fear rather than love. Whatever it was, it broke him. He moved out of the family home. He became estranged from his father and from Christianity. For several years he drifted, drinking and spending and trying to be someone else. His father watched this dissolution with anguish, believing he'd lost his last surviving son not to death, but to spiritual abandonment. The curse was working in a different way than Michael had expected. But then something shifted again. By 1838, just months before his father's death, Soren reconciled with him. We don't know what was said. We don't know what understanding they reached. But Kierkegaard moved back into the family home. He returned to faith, though it would never be the simple faith of his childhood. He committed himself to Christianity as the idea for which he would live and die. His mother had died in 1834, possibly from typhus. His father died on August 8, 1838, at age 82. The inheritance was substantial, approximately 31,000 riksdaler, enough to fund Kierkegaard's life and work for years to come. But more than money, he inherited his father's melancholy, his sense of guilt and anxiety, his pietistic emphasis on suffering, and also his talents for philosophical argument and creative imagination. Michael Kierkegaard had been both poison and gift to his son, damaging him while equipping him with the psychological depth that would make his philosophy possible. After his father's death, Kierkegaard finally focused on completing his degree. He'd been at university for 11 years, drifting and avoiding. Now he wrote his dissertation on irony, as practiced by Socrates, a topic that reveals everything about where his mind was. Irony meant saying one thing while meaning another, presenting a surface that hid depths, engaging with the world through indirection. It was his father's household. It was his own personality. It was how he would write his books. He petitioned the king to write his dissertation in Danish rather than Latin, only the third such request ever granted. He was allowed this, but had to condense his arguments into Latin theses to be defended publicly in Latin before receiving his degree. On October 20th, 1841, he graduated with a magister degree in philosophy, equivalent to a contemporary doctorate. He completed the pastoral seminary program that qualified him to become a Lutheran priest. But he never was ordained. He never became a pastor, though he occasionally preached in Copenhagen churches. His vocation would be writing, not ministry, though he'd spend his life wrestling with what that choice meant. But during this period, something else happened that would shape everything that followed. In 1837, at a spring gathering, Kierkegaard met a 15-year-old girl named Regine Olsen. He was 24. She was playing piano. He was transfixed. She later recalled that he made a very strong impression on her, that she was enraptured by his words and the way he spoke. For 3 years, he watched her from a distance, unable to act. Then on September 8th, 1840, while she played piano in her family's home, he finally spoke. "Oh, what do I care for music? It's you I want. I have wanted you for 2 years." She kept silent. He immediately went to her father, Councilman Olsen, to ask for her hand. Permission was granted. They became engaged, and Kierkegaard almost immediately realized he'd made a terrible mistake. Not because he didn't love her. The problem was exactly that he loved her too much, and he knew, with the psychological insight he'd spent his life developing, that marriage to him would destroy her. There was something spectral about him, something broken and melancholic and impossible. Within 6 months, she would have gone to pieces. A real relationship with him was impossible. But how do you explain that to an 18-year-old girl who loves you? How do you break an engagement in 1840s Copenhagen without destroying her reputation and your own? Kierkegaard tried to make Regine end it. He tried to make her hate him. He pretended to be a scoundrel who'd trifled with her affections, hoping she'd reject him in disgust and move on with her life. It didn't work. She fought to keep him. She refused to let go. Finally, on August 11th, 1841, he sealed his engagement ring in a letter and put it in the post. The engagement was over. He called the following months the time of terrors. Regine was devastated. Her family was outraged. Copenhagen society was scandalized, and Kierkegaard, unable to bear the weight of what he'd done, fled to Berlin. Berlin in the winter of 1841 wasn't refuge. It was exile disguised as education. Kierkegaard arrived in October, ostensibly to attend lectures by Friedrich Wilhelm Joseph Schelling, the aging German philosopher who'd promised to demolish Hegel's system. The lectures attracted an impressive crowd. Karl Marx was there, Jakob Burckhardt, Friedrich Engels, the intellectual elite of Europe, gathering to witness what they hoped would be a philosophical revolution. Kierkegaard sat among them, taking notes. But his mind was elsewhere. He'd brought something with him to Berlin, a manuscript. Most of the second volume was already complete before he'd left Copenhagen, written during the final months of his engagement, when he knew what was coming but couldn't stop it. Now, in a rented room far from Regine, far from the scandal, far from everything, he threw himself into finishing the first volume. The book would be called Either/Or. It's one of the strangest books ever written. Over 800 pages in 2 volumes, published pseudonymously under the name Victor Eremita, which means victorious hermit. The structure itself is a performance. Victor Eremita claims to have discovered 2 sets of papers hidden in a secret compartment of an antique desk. One set written by a young aesthete known only as A, the other by an older judge named Wilhelm. The aesthete's papers make up the first volume. Fragmented, brilliant, desperate. Essays on Mozart's Don Giovanni. Reflections on boredom. A diary of a seducer that tracks the psychological manipulation of a young woman. This is someone living for pleasure, for experience, for the endless variety of aesthetic enjoyment. But underneath the wit and sophistication runs a current of despair so deep it threatens to swallow everything. The second volume contains Judge Wilhelm's response, long ethical letters attempting to convince the aesthete that the aesthetic life is self-defeating, that true selfhood requires ethical commitment, marriage, duty. The judge represents the ethical sphere of existence, grounded in responsibility and social obligation. And Victor Eremita, the editor who supposedly found these papers, he refuses to tell us which perspective is correct. The book ends with a sermon by a country pastor tucked in as a kind of appendix, gesturing toward a religious sphere beyond both aesthetic and ethical existence. But that gesture remains undeveloped. The reader is left to choose, either/or. What Kierkegaard was doing here would define his entire authorship. He wasn't writing philosophy in the traditional sense. He wasn't constructing a system or proving theorems. He was creating existential possibilities, showing different ways of living, letting readers encounter themselves in the mirror of these literary constructions. And he was doing it through indirection. This is crucial. Kierkegaard believed that truth, especially existential truth about how to live, couldn't be communicated directly. You can't simply tell someone how to exist authentically. They have to discover it themselves through their own encounter with possibility. So he created pseudonyms, characters who embodied different life views, not to hide behind them, though the pseudonyms did provide some protection, but to create distance, to force readers to engage rather than simply receive. The aesthete in Either/Or is seductive. His writing is more interesting than Judge Wilhelm's, more alive. This is intentional. Kierkegaard wanted readers to feel the pull of the aesthetic life, to understand its attraction before recognizing its emptiness. Indirect communication meant making the reader work, struggle, choose. Either/Or was published in February 1843, 18 months after Kierkegaard broke his engagement. Copenhagen's literary world was stunned. Who was Victor Eremita? Who wrote this massive, strange, brilliant book? Speculation ran wild. Kierkegaard maintained his disguise but couldn't resist dropping hints. He'd sit in cafes and listen to people discuss the book, occasionally offering ironic comments that suggested insider knowledge. The performance extended beyond the page into his daily life, but either-or was just the beginning. Within months, he published 2 more books on the same day, February 16th, 1843, both under pseudonyms, both completely different from either/or and from each other. Fear and Trembling, written under the name Johannes de Silentio, takes up the story of Abraham and Isaac. God commands Abraham to sacrifice his son. Abraham obeys, raising the knife before God intervenes at the last moment. The standard interpretation treats this as a story about faith and obedience. Johannes de Silentio finds something more terrifying. Abraham can't explain himself. There's no universal principle that justifies what he's doing. Ethically, he's a murderer. He's willing to kill his son. The ethical sphere, represented by Judge Wilhelm in either/or, would condemn him absolutely. But Abraham acts on a higher calling, a religious sphere that transcends ethics entirely. This is the teleological suspension of the ethical, the idea that religious faith might require going beyond or even against universal moral principles. It's disturbing. It should be disturbing. Kierkegaard isn't offering comfort. He's showing what faith actually demands if you take it seriously. And Abraham can't communicate what he's doing to anyone. Not to Sarah, not to Isaac, not to the ethical community. He's absolutely alone in his relationship with God. This is the knight of faith, isolated by a calling that others can't understand or share. The book is also about Regine. Obviously, Kierkegaard saw himself as a kind of Abraham, called to sacrifice the thing he loved most. The engagement had to be broken for reasons he couldn't explain, couldn't justify to others. Was this genuine religious calling or elaborate rationalization? The book doesn't answer. It just presents the terror and isolation of existing in the religious sphere. The same day Fear and Trembling appeared, so did Repetition, pseudonymously authored by Constantine Constantius. It's a novella about a young man who falls in love, breaks the relationship, and then struggles with whether repetition is possible. Can you go back? Can you recover what's lost? The answer, delivered through a complex narrative structure involving Job and a theatrical farce, seems to be no, and yes. And it depends what you mean by repetition. Again, Regine haunts every page. Kierkegaard was writing his way through the breakup, processing it, justifying it, mourning it, all while disguising his personal investment through pseudonymous indirection. The books were both deeply personal and deliberately impersonal, confessional and concealed, and he wasn't finished. In 1844, more books appeared. Philosophical Fragments by Johannes Climacus asked whether Christianity's historical claims could be reconciled with philosophical truth. The Concept of Anxiety by Vigilius Haufniensis explored the psychological state preceding sin. Multiple volumes of upbuilding discourses appeared under Kierkegaard's own name, more conventionally religious than the pseudonymous works. The pace was inhuman. Between 1843 and 1846, Kierkegaard published roughly a book every 2 months. His inheritance from his father was funding this productivity. He wasn't wealthy by Copenhagen standards, but he had enough to live modestly and write constantly. He developed a routine, mornings for writing, afternoons for his daily walk through Copenhagen, what he called his people bath. He'd stroll through the streets, stopping to chat with anyone and everyone. Shopkeepers, students, beggars, aristocrats. He made himself a familiar figure, eccentric but approachable, always ready with a witty comment or philosophical observation. These walks served multiple purposes. They were research, observation of human types and social dynamics. They were performance, maintaining his public persona as a slightly ridiculous dandy, and they were communion, his way of staying connected to ordinary life while spending his mornings in abstract philosophical territory. But the walks were also becoming difficult, because by 1845, Kierkegaard had made a serious enemy. The Corsair was Copenhagen's satirical magazine, notorious for vicious attacks on public figures through caricatures and mockery. Its editor, Meir Goldschmidt, was actually an admirer of Kierkegaard's work. The magazine had deliberately avoided targeting him. Kierkegaard, for complicated reasons involving literary politics and personal pride, decided this protection was insulting. In December 1845, writing under a pseudonym in a rival publication, he challenged the Corsair to attack him. If they were truly satirical, truly fearless, why were they leaving him alone? The Corsair obliged with enthusiasm. Starting in January 1846, they published a series of cartoon caricatures showing Kierkegaard as a hunchbacked figure with grotesquely uneven trouser legs. The caricatures were devastating precisely because they focused on something Kierkegaard couldn't defend against. How do you respond to mockery of your physical appearance? Any denial just confirms the ridicule. Copenhagen loved it. Suddenly everyone was staring at Kierkegaard's legs during his daily walks. Children pointed, adults smirked, street vendors made jokes. The man who'd carefully cultivated his public image as a witty, sophisticated figure became a laughingstock. The psychological impact was severe. Kierkegaard became increasingly reclusive. The people baths, his connection to ordinary social life, became unbearable. He withdrew into his writing, bitter and isolated, but he also recognized something. The Corsair affair was teaching him what he'd written about in Fear and Trembling, what it meant to stand alone, to be misunderstood by the crowd, to suffer for convictions others mocked. The abstract philosophical categories were becoming lived experience. In his journals, he reflected on this. The suffering was transformative. It was pushing him deeper into religious existence, away from the aesthetic and ethical spheres he'd explored in his books. The mockery was stripping away his attachment to social recognition, forcing him to find identity elsewhere, and he kept writing. Stages on Life's Way appeared in 1845, another massive pseudonymous work expanding the either/or structure into 3 stages: aesthetic, ethical, religious. Concluding unscientific postscript, published in 1846 under Johannes Climacus's name, ran to over 500 pages and claimed to be a mere appendix to the earlier philosophical fragments. The postscript is where Kierkegaard's critique of Hegelian philosophy becomes most explicit. Hegel had built a system claiming to capture absolute truth through dialectical logic. Kierkegaard found this absurd. Truth isn't objective knowledge you acquire by thinking. Truth is subjectivity. It's how you exist, what you commit to, how you live. The famous formulation appears here: truth is subjectivity. Not that objective facts don't exist, but that existential truth, the truth that matters for living, can't be captured in objective systems. You can know everything about Christianity as a historical phenomenon, as a set of doctrines, and still miss the point entirely. What matters is whether you exist as a Christian, whether you've made that subjective commitment. This is why Kierkegaard rejected the idea of being a systematic philosopher. Systems are for spectators. He wanted to create readers who were participants, who recognized themselves in what they read and were forced to decide how to exist. By 1846, Kierkegaard believed his authorship was complete. The postscript ended with a first and last declaration, where Kierkegaard, writing in his own name for the first time, acknowledged authorship of all the pseudonymous works and explained his method. He was 33 years old. He planned to stop writing and become a country pastor, finally taking up the vocation he'd prepared for years earlier. But something happened that changed everything, something that would consume the rest of his life and turn his final years into an open war with the institution he'd spent his entire authorship defending. That something was Bishop Jacob Peter Mynster's death in January 1854. Mynster had been Denmark's leading churchman for decades, the Bishop of Zealand and primate of the Danish Lutheran Church. More importantly, he'd been a close friend of Kierkegaard's father. The young Soren had grown up respecting Mynster as a spiritual authority. The bishop represented everything dignified and established in Danish Christianity. When Mynster died, the tributes poured in. Newspapers praised his wisdom. Colleagues celebrated his leadership. And Hans Martensen, who would succeed Mynster as bishop, delivered a funeral oration, calling him a witness to the truth. Those three words detonated something in Kierkegaard. A witness to the truth. That specific phrase appears in the New Testament, describing those who suffered and died for Christianity. The apostles were witnesses. The early martyrs were witnesses. People who risked everything, who stood against the world, who chose persecution over compromise. Mynster had been comfortable, wealthy, respected by everyone. He'd served the state church, an institution so thoroughly integrated with Danish society that being born Danish meant being baptized Lutheran. No risk, no suffering, no witness. Calling Mynster a witness to the truth was, in Kierkegaard's view, obscene. He waited. Martensen's eulogy was delivered in February 1854. Kierkegaard said nothing publicly for months. He wanted to be certain. This wasn't anger talking. This was something he'd been circling around his entire authorship. Something about the gap between what Christianity claimed to be and what it had become. Finally, in December 1854, Kierkegaard published an article attacking Martensen's characterization. The piece was restrained. Philosophical even, it argued carefully that Mynster, however admirable personally, couldn't honestly be called a witness to the truth. He'd lived too comfortably, served the establishment too faithfully. The response was immediate outrage. How dare this eccentric writer attack a beloved bishop who couldn't defend himself? The church establishment closed ranks. Martensen responded with condescension, dismissing Kierkegaard's arguments. Something broke loose in Kierkegaard then. For years he'd published under pseudonyms, hidden behind elaborate literary structures, communicated indirectly. Now he started writing under his own name, directly, attacking the Danish church with escalating fury. He published a series of articles in a newspaper called Fædrelandet. Then when the newspaper wouldn't publish everything he wanted to say, he started his own periodical. He called it The Instant, and it appeared irregularly through 1855. 21 issues total, each one a sustained assault on institutional Christianity. The argument was simple, brutal, and went far beyond defending his criticism of Mynster. The Danish Lutheran Church wasn't Christianity. It was Christianity's opposite, a massive lie that made following Christ comfortable and respectable when the New Testament clearly demanded the exact reverse. Jesus was homeless, persecuted, executed. His disciples were martyred. Early Christians faced lions in arenas. The gospel promised suffering, not success. Whoever wants to save their life will lose it. But the Danish church, its priests lived in nice houses, drew state salaries, enjoyed social prestige. Going to church was what respectable people did. Being Christian cost nothing, required nothing. It was cultural identity, not existential commitment. Kierkegaard's attacks became increasingly uncompromising. He called the church a criminal organization. He told people to stop attending services. Better honest paganism than this baptized worldliness. At least pagans weren't pretending to follow Christ while living for comfort and approval. The clergy were parasites, he wrote. They'd turned Christianity into a career, extracting money from ordinary people while preaching a neutered gospel that demanded nothing. They'd made God into a kindly grandfather who wanted everyone happy. When the New Testament God demanded you lose everything, take up your cross, follow Christ into suffering and rejection. This wasn't theological debate. This was war. Copenhagen was scandalized. The man who'd been a laughingstock because of his trouser legs was now a dangerous radical, attacking the institution everyone respected. Church leaders denounced him, newspaper editorials condemned him, former friends distanced themselves. Kierkegaard didn't care anymore, or rather, he cared about only one thing: telling the truth as he saw it, regardless of consequences. The instant circulation grew. Working-class readers, people who'd never engaged with Kierkegaard's philosophical works, started following the attacks. There was something viscerally satisfying about watching this eccentric intellectual go after the establishment. The priests who collected tithes while preaching about Christ's poverty. The bishops living in palaces while claiming to follow the homeless carpenter from Nazareth. But Kierkegaard wasn't a populist. He wasn't trying to start a movement or reform the church. He was doing something stranger and more absolute. He was trying to make clear what Christianity actually demanded, knowing almost no one would accept it. True Christianity, as Kierkegaard presented it in these final writings, was essentially impossible in this world. It required renouncing everything worldly, everything comfortable, everything that made life bearable. It demanded you become a stranger to society, accept mockery and persecution, choose suffering. This is why he'd never married Regine. This is why he'd lived alone, devoted everything to his work. He was trying imperfectly to exist as a Christian, and it was unbearable. The loneliness, the mockery, the gap between what he believed and how he actually lived. He wasn't claiming to have succeeded. He was pointing at the New Testament and saying, look at what it actually requires. Then look at what we've made it into. The difference is the measure of our dishonesty. The final issue of The Instant appeared in September 1855. Kierkegaard was 42 years old. His health was failing. The intensity of the writing campaign, combined with years of physical neglect, was destroying him. On October 2nd, he collapsed on the street. Passers-by helped him home, but he couldn't recover. His legs, the ones the Corsair had mocked, had given out completely. He was taken to Frederick's hospital. The doctors couldn't identify what was wrong. Some kind of progressive paralysis spreading through his body. Spinal disease, maybe, or complications from years of physical and nervous exhaustion. He'd driven himself too hard for too long. Kierkegaard knew he was dying. He accepted it with strange calm. When his brother Peter, now a prominent theologian himself, visited and offered to bring a priest to give communion, Soren refused. The refusal shocked Peter. Their father had raised them in the church. Soren had spent his entire life writing about Christianity. Surely he wanted the sacraments before death, but Kierkegaard was consistent to the end. The priests represented the institutional church he'd spent his final year attacking. Accepting communion from them would contradict everything he'd written in The Instant. He wouldn't compromise now. Peter begged. Friends visited and pleaded. Take communion, they said. Make peace with the church. Don't die in this stubborn isolation. Kierkegaard refused every time. He told Emil Busen, the one friend who stayed close through everything, that his whole life had been a suffering, that he was glad it was ending, that he'd said what needed saying. The paralysis continued spreading. By November, he couldn't move at all. He lay in the hospital bed, conscious but increasingly weak, waiting for death. Copenhagen buzzed with gossip. The famous writer was dying, refusing the sacraments, apparently unrepentant for his attacks on the church. Some said he'd gone mad. Others said he was finally showing his true colours as an enemy of Christianity. Neither interpretation was right. Kierkegaard wasn't rejecting Christianity. He was rejecting what Christianity had become, what the church had made it into, the comfortable lie, the respectable religion that cost nothing and promised everything. On November 11th, 1855, Soren Kierkegaard died. He was 42 years old. The funeral was complicated. The church couldn't refuse to bury him. He'd been baptized Lutheran and never formally left. But how do you honor someone who'd spent his final year calling your institution a fraud? They held the service at the Church of Our Lady in Copenhagen. Bishop Martensen, the man Kierkegaard had attacked, didn't attend. The service was subdued, careful. The eulogies praised Kierkegaard's intellect, while diplomatically ignoring his final writings. Then at the graveside, something unexpected happened. Kierkegaard's nephew, Henrik Lund, interrupted the proceedings. He read aloud from The Instant, the attacks on the church. He claimed his uncle's Christianity was more genuine than anything the assembled priests represented. The crowd was outraged. This was a funeral, not a political demonstration. But Henrik continued, insisting that burying Kierkegaard with conventional religious honours betrayed everything he'd stood for. The disruption became minor scandal. Newspapers covered it. The church condemned it. And Kierkegaard, who'd spent his life creating scenes and controversies, had one final controversy at his own burial. He was buried in Assistens Cemetery in Copenhagen, the same cemetery where his parents rested. The grave was simple, no elaborate monument, just a marker with his name and dates. His will left everything to Regine. She was living in the Danish West Indies by then, her husband serving as colonial governor. When she learned about the bequest, she refused it. The man who'd broken their engagement 15 years earlier, who'd written cryptic books she probably only half understood, had never stopped thinking of her as his wife. The money eventually went to Peter, who used it to publish Soren's papers and journals, thousands of pages of private writings, reflections on his life, his work, his relationship with his father, his anguish over Regine, his thoughts about Christianity and existence, and the impossibility of living authentically in modern society. These journals would prove crucial for understanding what Kierkegaard had been attempting. Because during his lifetime, almost no one grasped it. His books sold poorly. His philosophical works were considered obscure and eccentric. His attacks on the church were seen as the ravings of a bitter man. Copenhagen remembered him as the hunchback with uneven pants who'd made a fool of himself and died refusing the sacraments. For decades after his death, Kierkegaard remained a minor figure. Danish readers occasionally picked up either/or, found it interesting but strange, then moved on. His religious writings gathered dust. The journal stayed in Peter's possession, unpublished, unknown. Then something happened that Kierkegaard himself had predicted. The future started catching up with his ideas. The first person to really notice was a German philosopher named Georg Brandes. This was the 1870s, nearly 20 years after Kierkegaard's death. Brandes was giving lectures on 19th century literature at the University of Copenhagen, and he decided to include a section on this forgotten Danish writer who died in obscurity. He read through the published works, then he got access to the journals Peter had been sitting on. What he found astonished him. Kierkegaard wasn't just some eccentric religious crank. He was a psychological genius who dissected the human condition with surgical precision. Brandes began lecturing about Kierkegaard across Europe. In Germany, the lectures created a sensation. Young intellectuals discovered this Danish philosopher who seemed to be speaking directly to their anxieties about modern life, who understood that systematic philosophy couldn't capture lived experience, who'd written about despair and authenticity decades before these concepts became fashionable. The timing was perfect. Europe was entering a crisis of meaning. Traditional religion was losing its grip. Scientific materialism couldn't answer existential questions. Nietzsche was declaring God dead. And here was Kierkegaard, who'd anticipated all of it. German translations of the works began appearing. Fear and Trembling first, then either/or, then the religious writings. They spread through intellectual circles like wildfire. By the 1890s, Kierkegaard was being discussed in German universities, in Parisian cafes, in literary salons across Europe. But the interpretation was selective. Different movements claimed different aspects of his thought. The existentialists loved the stuff about anxiety and authentic choice. The theologians focused on his Christian writings. The psychologists were fascinated by his analysis of despair. Nobody was quite getting the full picture. 20th century philosophy would be unthinkable without him. Martin Heidegger's entire project of fundamental ontology, his analysis of authentic versus inauthentic existence, draws directly from Kierkegaard. Being and Time is basically a systematic elaboration of Kierkegaardian themes, though Heidegger was careful to distance himself from the religious dimension. Jean-Paul Sartre read Kierkegaard and found the foundation for existentialism. The idea that existence precedes essence, that we're condemned to be free, that we create ourselves through our choices. Kierkegaard had said all of this a century earlier. Sartre stripped away the Christian framework and kept the existential mechanics. Karl Jaspers used Kierkegaard's concept of limit situations, those moments of crisis that force us to confront fundamental questions about existence. Shipwreck, as Jaspers called it. The experience of failure that reveals what we really are. Even Wittgenstein, who approached philosophy from a completely different angle, found something valuable in Kierkegaard. The idea that some truths can't be stated directly but must be shown. That philosophical problems often arise from confusions about language and life. The later Wittgenstein sounds surprisingly Kierkegaardian at times. The theologians had their own Kierkegaard. Karl Barth used him to challenge liberal theology, to reassert the absolute otherness of God, to emphasize the leap of faith required for genuine Christianity. Paul Tillich drew on Kierkegaard's analysis of anxiety to develop his concept of the courage to be. In psychology, his influence was equally profound. Rollo May and other existential psychologists built entire therapeutic approaches on Kierkegaardian foundations. The analysis of anxiety, the concept of the self as a task rather than a given, the idea that mental illness often stems from avoiding authentic choice, these became cornerstones of humanistic psychology. But here's what's strange. As Kierkegaard became more influential, he also became more misunderstood. Each movement took what it wanted and ignored the rest. The secular existentialists dropped the Christianity. The theologians minimized the psychological insights. The psychologists ignored the religious framework. Nobody wanted to deal with the whole Kierkegaard. The melancholy Dane who was simultaneously a Christian thinker, a psychological analyst, a literary artist, and a fierce critic of modern society, who wrote under pseudonyms to avoid being pinned down, who insisted that truth is subjectivity while also believing in objective Christian doctrine. The fragmenting of his thought into digestible pieces betrayed his central method. Kierkegaard had used indirect communication precisely because he believed truth couldn't be transmitted like information. You can't tell someone how to become an authentic self. You can only create situations that force them to choose. His pseudonymous works were strategic. Each pseudonym represented a different existence sphere, a different way of being in the world. You weren't supposed to agree with any of them completely. You were supposed to struggle with them, to find yourself somewhere in the gaps between perspectives. But 20th century readers wanted clear positions. They wanted Kierkegaard the existentialist, or Kierkegaard the theologian, or Kierkegaard the psychologist. They wanted to cite him as an authority, which was exactly what he'd spent his career trying to prevent. The irony would have amused him. The man who attacked systematic philosophy became systematized. The thinker who insisted on subjective truth became an objective reference point. The writer who hid behind pseudonyms to avoid becoming an authority became cited as one. His personal life got mythologized too. The broken engagement with Regine became a romantic tragedy. The Corsair affair a martyrdom. His death a statement. Scholars built careers analysing his psychology, his relationship with his father, his sexuality, his possible mental illnesses. Some argued he was clinically depressed. Others said he had an anxiety disorder. Freudians found Oedipal conflicts everywhere. Later scholars suggested he might have been on the autism spectrum, which would explain his social difficulties and intense focus. All of this missed the point. Kierkegaard wasn't a case study. He was a thinker who'd used his own psychological struggles as material for philosophical investigation. The personal pain wasn't separate from the intellectual work. It was the laboratory where he tested his ideas about existence. His influence kept spreading in unexpected directions. The French postmodernists found resources in his critique of systematic thought. Derrida saw connections between Kierkegaardian irony and deconstruction. Levinas drew on his ethics of the individual and the absolute. Literary theory embraced him. His use of pseudonyms, his blending of philosophy and literature, his awareness that form and content couldn't be separated, all of this made him a precursor to modernist and postmodernist writing. Authors like Kafka and Camus were clearly working in his shadow. Political philosophy had a harder time with him. Kierkegaard had no real political theory. He was skeptical of mass movements, suspicious of social progress, indifferent to questions of justice and equality. His focus on the individual made him useless for collective political projects. The Marxists dismissed him as bourgeois and reactionary. The liberals found him too religious and pessimistic. Only certain conservatives claimed him, and even they had to ignore his attacks on established institutions and comfortable Christianity. But his cultural critique proved prophetic. He'd warned about the levelling effect of mass media, the way public discourse reduces everything to opinion, the danger of losing individual identity in the crowd. These concerns became increasingly relevant as the 20th century progressed. His analysis of anxiety anticipated the modern condition. Not clinical anxiety, though he understood that too. He meant the anxiety inherent in freedom, in having to choose without guarantees, in being responsible for creating your own meaning. This was the anxiety Sartre would later describe, the dizziness of possibility. Kierkegaard had identified it first. He'd seen that modern life, with its collapse of traditional authority and its infinite options, would make anxiety the fundamental mood of existence. His concept of despair was equally prescient. He defined it as a sickness of the self, a failure to be who you are. You can be in despair without knowing it. You can live your entire life avoiding the confrontation with your own existence. This unconscious despair, this quiet suffering of people who never become themselves, who never make real choices, who drift through life following scripts written by others. Kierkegaard mapped this territory before psychology had the tools to explore it. The religious dimension of his thought remained controversial. Secular readers wanted to extract the existential insights and discard the Christianity, but Kierkegaard insisted the two were inseparable. The anxiety of freedom, the need for authentic choice, the horror of self-deception, these drove toward religious commitment as their only resolution. Not comfortable religion, not the Christianity of his Danish contemporaries, the terrifying Christianity of Abraham, willing to sacrifice everything on faith alone. The paradoxical Christianity that offends reason and demands total transformation. Whether you accept this religious dimension or not determines how you read Kierkegaard. If you take it seriously, he's a Christian thinker whose psychological insights serve a religious purpose. If you bracket it, he becomes an existentialist whose religious language is historical baggage. Both readings are incomplete. Kierkegaard can't be neatly categorized because he deliberately resisted categorization. He wrote dialogically, presenting perspectives in tension, forcing readers to work out their own positions. His influence peaked in the mid-20th century. After World War II, existentialism dominated European intellectual life. Kierkegaard was suddenly everywhere, claimed by movements he would have found horrifying. Sartrean existentialism, with its atheism and political engagement, was precisely what Kierkegaard had warned against. The idea that we create values through choice, that there's no objective truth beyond our freedom. This was exactly the aesthetic sphere he'd criticised in either/or. But the existentialists didn't care. They took the psychological machinery and left the theological framework. They used his analysis of anxiety while rejecting his solution. They wanted freedom without God, choice without faith. The religious readers had their own problems. Neo-Orthodox theologians like Barth used Kierkegaard to attack liberal Christianity, to emphasize divine transcendence and human sinfulness. But they ignored his psychological subtlety, his literary artistry, his refusal to speak directly about religious truth. Catholic thinkers struggled with him. His Protestantism was too radical, his individualism too extreme, his rejection of mediation too absolute. But they recognized the power of his religious passion, his willingness to follow faith to its most difficult conclusions. By the 1960s, something shifted. The existentialist moment passed. Continental philosophy moved towards structuralism and post-structuralism. Analytic philosophy dominated the Anglo-American world. Kierkegaard's star dimmed. He didn't disappear, but he became more specialized. Kierkegaard's scholars studied Kierkegaard. Theologians referenced him in footnotes, but he was no longer the vital contemporary voice he'd been for mid-century intellectuals. Then came another revival, smaller but deeper. Late 20th century thinkers returned to Kierkegaard with fresh eyes, trying to read him on his own terms rather than mining him for useful concepts. They paid attention to his literary strategies, his use of pseudonyms and indirect communication. They took seriously his claim that form and content were inseparable. They stopped trying to extract a system from his works and started engaging with them as performances. This revealed dimensions that earlier readers had missed. The humour, for instance. Kierkegaard was genuinely funny, using irony and satire with devastating effect, but previous interpreters had been so focused on his profundity they'd missed the jokes. The aesthetic dimension too. His prose was magnificent, carefully crafted, full of rhetorical fireworks. He wasn't just a philosopher who happened to write well. The writing was the philosophy, the medium was the message, and the complexity of his religious thought became clearer. He wasn't simply a fideist demanding blind faith, he was exploring the phenomenology of religious experience, the psychology of belief, the existential structure of Christian commitment. Modern Kierkegaard scholarship is massive. Thousands of books and articles in dozens of languages, complete editions of his works and journals, international societies and conferences. He's become an industry which would have appalled him. But the core questions he raised remain unanswered. How do you become yourself? What does it mean to exist authentically? Can you build a meaningful life in a world without transcendent guarantees? Is faith possible after the collapse of traditional authority? These aren't academic questions. They're lived problems that every person confronts, whether they have the vocabulary to articulate them or not. Kierkegaard gave us tools for thinking about these problems, even if he didn't provide solutions. His legacy is paradoxical. Like everything about him, he's influential and misunderstood, widely read and rarely comprehended, present everywhere in modern thought and absent as a coherent voice. The man who died in obscurity became a philosophical giant. The books that barely sold in his lifetime became canonical texts. The eccentric Dane with uneven pants shaped how we think about existence, selfhood, and meaning. But there's another legacy, quieter and more personal. Kierkegaard changed how we experience ourselves. Before him, philosophy dealt in abstractions, reason, virtue, knowledge. Even the Romantics who emphasized feeling tended toward grand statements about humanity in general. Kierkegaard insisted on the particular. Not humanity, but this person. Not existence in the abstract, but my existence, your existence, the concrete reality of being alive right now. This shift is subtle, but revolutionary. When you catch yourself questioning your choices, wondering if you're living authentically or just playing a role, you're thinking in Kierkegaardian terms, whether you know it or not. When you feel the weight of freedom, the burden of having to choose who you'll become, that's his inheritance. He gave us a vocabulary for self-consciousness, for the experience of being both subject and object, observer and observed. The concept of anxiety, as he understood it, has become fundamental to modern psychology. Not clinical anxiety, though that's related, existential anxiety, the dizziness of freedom, the vertigo that comes from standing before infinite possibilities with no predetermined path. Freud read Kierkegaard and recognized something important, though he approached it from a different angle. The existential analysts, Binswanger and Boss and later Rollo May, built directly on his insights. Consider his analysis of despair in The Sickness Unto Death. Most people think despair means feeling bad, being depressed. Kierkegaard argued that despair is a structural feature of human existence. We're beings who must relate to ourselves, who must become ourselves, but we constantly fail at this task. We flee into distractions, into social roles, into anything that lets us avoid the burden of selfhood. The person who seems perfectly content, who never questions anything, who lives entirely within conventional expectations, this person is in despair, according to Kierkegaard. The deepest despair. They've given up on becoming themselves. They've chosen the comfort of conformity over the difficulty of individuality. And they're not even aware they've made this choice. This is uncomfortable territory. It means you can't evaluate your life by external standards. Success, happiness, social approval, none of these guarantee you're actually living authentically. In fact, they might be evidence that you're not. The person who appears most together might be most lost. His religious writings push this further. Faith isn't about beliefs you hold or rituals you perform. It's a mode of existence, a way of relating to yourself and to God that involves total transformation. The person who attends church every Sunday, who knows all the doctrines, who lives a morally upright life, might have no faith whatsoever. They're going through motions, playing a role, avoiding the terrifying encounter with the absolute. Real faith, in Kierkegaard's view, requires you to stand alone before God. No church can mediate this. No priest can do it for you. No doctrine can make it easier. You have to make the leap yourself, taking full responsibility for your choice, knowing it can't be rationally justified. This drove the Danish church crazy. Kierkegaard spent his final years attacking Christendom, the comfortable bourgeois Christianity that had domesticated faith, turned it into a social institution, stripped it of its radical demands. He published a series of pamphlets under the title The Moment, brutal critiques of the established church and its clergy. The attacks were personal and vicious. He accused the bishops of being charlatans, the priests of being mercenaries, the whole system of being a fraud that had nothing to do with genuine Christianity. He called for people to stop attending church, to refuse the sacraments, to reject the entire apparatus of institutional religion. Why this fury in his final years? Several reasons tangled together. Bishop Münster, who had been his father's pastor and whom Kierkegaard had respected despite disagreements, died in 1854. At Münster's funeral, Hans Martensen, who would become the new bishop, gave a eulogy praising Münster as a witness to the truth. That phrase, witness to the truth, set Kierkegaard off. Münster had been a comfortable functionary, a representative of respectable Christianity. He'd never sacrificed anything, never risked anything, never stood alone against the crowd. Calling him a witness to the truth, comparing him implicitly to martyrs and apostles, was an obscenity. But the anger went deeper than one funeral oration. Kierkegaard had spent years developing his ideas, writing his books, trying to show people what real Christianity demanded. And Denmark had ignored him. Or worse, they'd treated him as entertainment, as the eccentric writer who produced interesting books. They'd completely missed the point. The Corsair affair had left scars. Being mocked in the streets turned into a joke. This wasn't just personal humiliation. It was proof that Copenhagen society was shallow, that people cared only for appearances, that genuine seriousness was impossible in this environment. He became increasingly isolated. The daily walks he'd loved became impossible. People stared, pointed, made comments. He retreated to his apartment, seeing almost no one, writing furiously, burning through what remained of his inheritance to publish his attacks on the church. His health deteriorated. He'd always been physically fragile, his spine curved, his constitution weak. Now he was collapsing. In September 1855, he fell on the street and couldn't get up. He was taken to Frederick's hospital, where he refused most treatment. For 6 weeks he lay dying. His brother Peter, now a bishop himself, visited and tried to reconcile with him. Soren was polite but distant. Peter represented everything he'd been fighting against: the institutional church, the comfortable compromise between Christianity and worldly success. Emil Busen, his old friend from university, visited regularly. Their conversations were recorded, fragments of which survive. Kierkegaard spoke about his work, about his certainty that he'd been right, about his readiness to die. He seemed almost cheerful, as if finally being released from a burden he'd carried too long. He refused communion from the established church. This was significant. He was dying as a Christian, but outside the institution, maintaining his protest to the end. He wanted to make clear that you didn't need the church's mediation, that the relationship with God was direct and personal. On November 11th, 1855, Soren Kierkegaard died. He was 42 years old. The funeral was chaos. Thousands attended, partly from genuine respect, partly from curiosity. The establishment wanted to honour him, to claim him as one of their own despite his attacks. His nephew Henrik Lund stood up during the service to protest, to say that Soren would have hated this, that using the state church's rituals for his burial was a betrayal of everything he'd stood for. The protest created a scandal. The ceremony dissolved into arguments. Some people walked out, others defended the church's right to bury him properly. It was fitting in a way. Even his funeral became an argument about authenticity, about the tension between individual conviction and social institutions. He left behind boxes of manuscripts, journals, notes. His published works numbered over 30 volumes. The journals, when finally published, would fill many more. He'd written constantly, compulsively, producing an enormous body of work in just over a decade of active authorship. His will left everything to Regine. She was married to Schlegel by then, living her own life. She refused the inheritance, didn't want the reminder of what they'd been to each other. The money went to his brother Peter, who used some of it to begin publishing Kierkegaard's papers. What did Regine think about all of it? We don't really know. She lived until 1904, almost 50 years after Soren's death. She gave a few interviews late in life, spoke about their relationship with affection, but also bewilderment. She never quite understood why he'd broken the engagement, why he'd made both of them suffer. She said once that she'd forgiven him long ago, that she bore no bitterness. But she also said she'd never stopped wondering what their life together might have been. He'd turned her into a symbol, an idea in his books. She'd been a real person who'd loved him and wanted to marry him. The distance between those two things, between the lived reality and the philosophical abstraction, was something neither of them could bridge. For decades after his death, Kierkegaard remained largely unknown outside Denmark. A few German scholars discovered him, wrote about him, but he was a minor figure, interesting but not essential. The massive Danish output wasn't translated. The pseudonyms confused people. The whole apparatus of his work seemed too strange, too personal, too tied to local controversies. Then came the First World War. European civilization, which had seemed so confident, so progressive, so rational, collapsed into mechanized slaughter. The optimistic philosophies of progress looked naive. The systematic philosophies that claimed to explain everything seemed hollow. Young intellectuals searching for alternatives discovered Kierkegaard. Here was someone who'd questioned progress, who'd attacked system building, who'd insisted on the primacy of individual existence over abstract theory. His critiques of Hegelian philosophy suddenly seemed prescient. His emphasis on anxiety and despair resonated with a generation living through catastrophe. The Germans translated him first. Karl Jaspers and Martin Heidegger both acknowledged his influence, though they incorporated his ideas into their own systems in ways he would have hated. The French discovered him next. Sartre, Camus, Marcel, each found something different in his work. By mid-century, he was everywhere, at least in continental philosophy and theology. The existentialist movement claimed him as a forefather. The neo-orthodox theologians used him to attack liberal Christianity. Literary critics appreciated his experiments with voice and perspective. Psychologists found resources in his analysis of anxiety and despair, but this popularity created new problems. Everyone was reading Kierkegaard, but was anyone understanding him? The pseudonyms got ignored or flattened into Kierkegaard's own views. The religious dimension was often stripped away by secular existentialists who wanted his analysis of freedom without his insistence on faith. The literary artistry was treated as decoration rather than integral to his philosophical method. Some scholars pushed back, insisting on reading him on his own terms. They emphasized the pseudonyms, the indirect communication, the refusal to present systematic truth. They showed how his form and content were inseparable, how you couldn't extract ideas from their presentation without distorting them. This created a divide in Kierkegaard studies that persists today. One camp treats him as a philosopher who happened to use unusual literary techniques. They mine his works for arguments about existence, selfhood, truth, faith. The other camp insists that his literary strategies are the philosophy, that indirect communication isn't a vehicle for delivering ideas but a practice of engaging readers in their own process of becoming. Both approaches have merit, but neither fully captures what he was doing. The real philosophical problem Kierkegaard poses is this: what happens when you realize that the way you're reading philosophy might be exactly what's preventing you from understanding it? Most people approach philosophical texts looking for positions to adopt or reject. What does this thinker believe about God, freedom, truth? Should I agree or disagree? This makes perfect sense for most philosophy. Descartes says he can doubt everything except his own existence. You either find his reasoning convincing or you don't. Kant argues we can never know things in themselves. You can evaluate his arguments, accept them or push back. But Kierkegaard isn't doing that. He's not presenting positions for you to evaluate. He's creating situations designed to make you aware of how you exist. The pseudonyms aren't masks hiding his real views. They're experiments in communication, each one addressing readers who exist in different ways. Johannes de Silentio, in Fear and Trembling, speaks to people who think they understand faith because they've heard about it in church. He shows them Abraham, the father of faith, doing something absolutely incomprehensible. God commands Abraham to kill his son, Isaac. Abraham prepares to do it. At the last moment, God stops him. Everyone calls Abraham faithful. But what does that faith actually look like? It's not trust that everything will work out. Abraham has no such assurance. It's not following moral duty. Murder violates every moral law. It's not even religious obedience in any normal sense, because what God commands contradicts what God himself has said about murder. Abraham exists in a relationship with God that suspends all the categories we use to make sense of action. He can't explain himself. He can't justify himself. He just goes. Most people, Kierkegaard suggests, have never faced anything remotely like this. They call themselves faithful, but they mean they trust that being good people will lead to good outcomes. They're living in the ethical sphere, following universal moral rules and calling it faith. They've never encountered the absolute paradox that Abraham faced. The book isn't arguing that you should imitate Abraham. That would miss the entire point. It's showing you what faith actually is in its full strangeness and terror, so you can see that what you call faith is probably something else entirely. Maybe you're fine with that. Maybe you should be. But at least you'll know what you're doing. This is indirect communication. Johannes isn't telling you what to believe. He's arranging a confrontation with an idea that forces you to reconsider your own self-understanding. Whether you end up embracing faith or rejecting it, you'll do so with eyes open to what you're actually choosing. The aesthetic works function differently. Either slash or presents two voices, A and B, aesthetic and ethical, are lives for pleasure, beauty, interesting experiences. He's brilliant, witty, insightful about desire and boredom and despair, but he's also profoundly unhappy, unable to commit to anything, ultimately empty. B represents ethical commitment, marriage, duty, choosing yourself as a particular person with obligations. He's more boring than A, but more stable, more real. People read this and think Kierkegaard is saying the ethical life is better than the aesthetic. Case closed. But look closer. B's letters to A keep revealing limitations in the ethical perspective. Marriage and duty give structure, but they don't solve the deepest human problems. The ethical person still faces anxiety, guilt, the question of ultimate meaning. The book doesn't resolve this. It leaves you suspended between two insufficient ways of existing. The structure itself is the communication. You're supposed to feel the pull of both voices, recognize yourself in both, and realize that neither one captures what you're actually looking for. The book creates a dissatisfaction that points beyond itself. This is why extracting Kierkegaard's philosophy from the texts distorts everything. His philosophy is the practice of engaging readers through these carefully constructed literary experiments. You can't separate form from content, but here's where things get complicated. In his final years, Kierkegaard seemed to abandon indirect communication entirely. He published a series of increasingly direct, increasingly violent attacks on the Danish state church. No more pseudonyms, no more literary artistry, just accusation, denunciation, rage. The church, he argued, had made Christianity into exactly what it shouldn't be: comfortable, respectable, aligned with worldly power. Bishops lived like aristocrats. Pastors preached about suffering while enjoying generous salaries. Everyone called themselves Christian without any cost, any sacrifice, any transformation. The whole system was a massive lie. Kierkegaard had been building toward this confrontation for years. His journals from the 1840s are full of complaints about Christendom, about how institutional Christianity had domesticated the radical message of the New Testament. But he'd held back from public attack, partly because he thought indirect communication was more effective, partly because he didn't want to make himself a martyr. Then in 1854, Bishop Jacob Münster died. Münster had been a friend of Kierkegaard's father, a respected figure in Danish religious life. Kierkegaard had deep personal affection for him, despite disagreeing with his theology. At the funeral, Hans Martensen, who would become Münster's successor as bishop, gave a eulogy praising Münster as a witness to the truth. That phrase triggered something in Kierkegaard: witness to the truth. That's what the New Testament calls martyrs, people who died for their faith. Münster had lived in wealth and comfort, praised by everyone, dying peacefully in his bed. Calling him a witness to the truth was an obscenity, a complete inversion of Christian categories. Kierkegaard waited several months, perhaps hoping the anger would pass. It didn't. In December 1854, he published an article attacking Martensen's eulogy. The Church's definition of Christianity, he wrote, had become so diluted that anyone could claim it. There was no cost, no risk, no transformation required. This wasn't Christianity. It was its opposite. The article caused immediate controversy. Kierkegaard followed it with more articles, pamphlets, eventually a series called The Moment, published at his own expense. The attacks grew more extreme. Danish Christianity was a fraud. Pastors were actors playing a role. Church attendance was participating in a lie. True Christianity meant suffering, meant going against the crowd, meant risking everything. The contemporary church offered none of that. Some of the rhetoric was brilliant, some was cruel. Kierkegaard attacked individual pastors by name, questioned their sincerity, accused them of caring more about salary than truth. He became obsessed, writing constantly, burning through what remained of his inheritance to publish pamphlet after pamphlet. His friends were horrified. This wasn't the subtle thinker they knew. This was someone consumed by rage, making enemies, destroying his own reputation. Hans Christian Andersen, who'd known Kierkegaard for years, wrote in his diary that he'd become impossible, a fanatic. But Kierkegaard seemed past caring what anyone thought. He'd spent his life communicating indirectly, creating beautiful literary works that readers could encounter on their own terms. It hadn't worked. People still thought they were Christians while living entirely worldly lives. The church still claimed to represent Christ while blessing the status quo. Someone had to speak directly, had to name the lie. The question that haunts this period: was this the culmination of his life's work or its betrayal? Had he always been building toward this moment of direct confrontation, using indirect communication as preparation? Or had he abandoned his own deepest insights about how truth gets communicated? You can read it either way. Maybe indirect communication was never meant to replace direct witness. Maybe it was just preparation, showing people the inadequacy of aesthetic and ethical existence so they'd be ready to hear the Christian message. When that preparation failed, direct attack became necessary. Or maybe the late attacks represent exactly what Kierkegaard had spent his career criticizing: making yourself the authority, telling people what to believe, turning Christianity into a position you argue for rather than a way of existing you demonstrate. The very thing he'd warned against. His health was failing. Years of overwork, irregular eating, probably chronic anxiety had worn him down. He was 42 but looked much older. He kept writing, kept publishing, kept attacking. Then in October 1855, he collapsed on the street, paralysis in his legs. He was taken to Frederick's Hospital. For 6 weeks he lay there, unable to move, visited by his brother Peter and a few remaining friends. He refused communion from any pastor, saying they were all state officials, not true servants of God. His books sold poorly. The massive output, 25 volumes in the standard edition, sat largely unread. His brother Peter inherited the papers, including thousands of pages of journals. He published some of them, edited carefully to make Soren seem more orthodox than he was. The full journals wouldn't appear for decades. Regine outlived him by nearly half a century. She'd married Schlegel, moved to the Danish West Indies where he served as governor, returned to Copenhagen after his death. She spoke rarely about Kierkegaard, but when she did, it was with a mixture of affection and puzzlement. She'd loved him, she said. She'd never fully understood why he'd left her. The books remained. All those voices, all those experiments in communication, all those attempts to show readers what they were actually doing when they claimed to believe, to love, to exist. They sat on shelves, waiting for readers who might be ready for them. What those future readers would discover was a body of work that resisted every attempt at simple summary, that seemed designed to frustrate anyone looking for straightforward answers, that kept opening new questions every time you thought you'd figured it out. They were waiting for a world that needed what Kierkegaard had been doing all along, making Christianity difficult again, making belief something you actually had to do, not just claim. The resurrection began in Germany. Georg Brandes, a Danish critic living in Copenhagen, gave lectures on Kierkegaard in the 1870s. He presented him as a psychological genius, someone who'd understood human consciousness with unusual depth. The lectures were published, translated. German academics noticed. Here was someone who'd been wrestling with Hegel's system before Marx, before Nietzsche, someone who'd seen the problems and found different solutions. The translations started appearing. Either Or in German in 1885, Fear and Trembling in 1882. The concept of anxiety in 1844, finally available to non-Danish readers in 1912. Each translation opened new audiences. Philosophers began citing him. Not extensively, not yet, but enough to establish that he existed, that he'd said something worth considering. Then came World War I. Europe tore itself apart. The 19th century's confidence in progress, reason, systematic philosophy, all of it collapsed in the trenches. Millions dead. Empires dissolved. The certainties that Hegel's system had promised felt like lies. People started looking for alternatives. Kierkegaard had been saying for decades that systems couldn't capture existence, that reason alone couldn't save you, that choosing mattered more than understanding. Suddenly that didn't sound crazy, it sounded necessary. Karl Barth, a Swiss theologian, read Kierkegaard in the wreckage of the war. Barth had been trained in liberal Protestant theology, the kind that tried to reconcile Christianity with modern thought, make it reasonable and comfortable. He looked at what that theology had produced: German pastors blessing troops, churches supporting nationalism, faith reduced to ethics and good feelings. It had failed completely. Kierkegaard's attack on Christendom, his insistence that faith required a leap, that following Christ meant suffering, not success. This struck Barth as exactly what Christianity needed. His commentary on Romans, published in 1919, channeled Kierkegaard's intensity. God wasn't humanity's partner in progress. God was wholly other, demanding, terrifying. Faith wasn't cultural membership. It was crisis, decision, risk. Barth's work sparked what became known as neo-orthodoxy or crisis theology, a movement back toward traditional Christian doctrines, but informed by Kierkegaard's existential emphasis. Emil Brunner, Reinhold Niebuhr, Paul Tillich, all engaged with Kierkegaard's ideas about faith and existence. They used his critique of Christendom to challenge liberal theology's compromises. Christianity couldn't be domesticated. It had to remain scandalous, difficult, demanding. Meanwhile, secular philosophers were discovering him too. Martin Heidegger's Being and Time, published in 1927, explored existence, authenticity, anxiety, death. Concepts Kierkegaard had examined in The Concept of Anxiety and The Sickness unto Death. Heidegger rarely acknowledged the debt, but it was obvious to anyone who'd read both. The structure of Dasein, being in the world, the analysis of dread, the emphasis on individual existence against the crowd, all of it echoed Kierkegaard. Jean-Paul Sartre read Kierkegaard in occupied Paris. Sartre was developing existentialism as an atheist philosophy, arguing that existence precedes essence, that humans create meaning through choice rather than discovering it in God or nature. He used Kierkegaard's framework, but removed the religious content. The leap of faith became the radical freedom to create yourself. Anguish replaced Kierkegaard's anxiety. The individual against the system became the individual creating meaning in an absurd universe. Sartre acknowledged that Kierkegaard was the first existentialist, even though Kierkegaard would have hated what Sartre did with his ideas. Albert Camus engaged with Kierkegaard differently. He saw the absurd clearly, the gap between human longing for meaning and the universe's silence. But where Kierkegaard leapt to faith, Camus refused. The leap was philosophical suicide, escaping the problem rather than living with it. Camus wanted to remain in the absurd, accept it, even embrace it. He respected Kierkegaard for seeing the problem so clearly. He just couldn't follow him to the solution. By mid-century, Kierkegaard had become canonical. Existentialism was the dominant philosophical movement in continental Europe. Theologians referenced him constantly. Psychologists found his analysis of anxiety and despair eerily prescient of later discoveries. Literary critics admired his narrative experiments, his use of pseudonyms, and indirect communication. The irony wasn't lost on careful readers. Kierkegaard had attacked the system. Now he'd become part of one, academic existentialism, with its own jargon, authorities, orthodoxies. Scholars wrote dissertations on him. Universities offered courses. He'd become exactly what he'd feared. A subject for professors rather than a provocation to live differently. But the books themselves resisted domestication. You couldn't really systematize either or turn Fear and Trembling into bullet points. The form kept disrupting attempts to make them safe. Students assigned to read him for class found themselves confronted, not just informed. The pseudonyms created distance that prevented simple identification. You couldn't just agree with Kierkegaard because you were never quite sure which voice spoke for him, if any did. His influence spread beyond philosophy and theology. Psychologists recognized that he'd anticipated Freud's insights about repression and self-deception. Jung's work on individuation, later existential psychology's emphasis on meaning and choice. Rollo May's Love and Will drew heavily on Kierkegaard's analysis of anxiety. Viktor Frankl's logotherapy echoed Kierkegaard's emphasis on choosing meaning in the face of despair. Literary modernists claimed him too. Kafka's novels felt Kierkegaardian, those impossible situations where rational action becomes absurd, where seeking clarity leads to deeper confusion. Beckett's characters waiting for meaning that never arrives, stuck in cycles they can't escape. These seemed like Kierkegaardian figures, stripped of the leap's possibility. Even writers who hadn't read him were working in territory he'd mapped. The religious impact was complicated. Neo-orthodoxy eventually faded. Liberal theology returned in new forms. But Kierkegaard's critique remained potent. Whenever Christianity got too comfortable, too aligned with power, too certain of itself, someone would invoke Kierkegaard's attack on Christendom. Liberation theologians in Latin America used his emphasis on individual choice and authentic faith to challenge institutional corruption. Radical orthodoxy drew on his insistence that Christianity must remain scandalous. Emergent church movements quoted his attacks on dead religion. His personal story became part of the appeal. The broken engagement, the conflict with his father, the public humiliation, the lonely death. Here was someone who'd lived the difficulty he wrote about. Not a comfortable academic working out abstractions, but someone whose philosophy emerged from actual suffering. That authenticity mattered. It made the work feel earned rather than invented. Regine's role in the mythology grew. She became the muse, the lost love, the sacrifice he'd made for his authorship. Scholars debated whether he'd been right to leave her, whether the work justified the damage to both their lives. Feminist critics pointed out that Regine's perspective was mostly absent from the story, her agency reduced to an occasion for Kierkegaard's reflection. She'd lived a full life after him, but the narrative kept freezing her at 19, heartbroken, waiting for an explanation he never quite gave. The journals became crucial once they were fully published. 25 volumes of private reflection, draft ideas, prayers, self-analysis. They provided context for the published works, but also complicated them. You could see him working through ideas, contradicting himself, changing his mind. The unified authorship he'd claimed in Point of View looked messier when you saw the process. Some scholars argued the journals were more authentic than the published pseudonymous works. Others insisted that Kierkegaard knew what he was doing when he kept them separate. Denmark eventually claimed him. The difficult son became a national treasure. His house was preserved. Streets were named for him. Students studied him in school, but this created its own problems. Kierkegaard, the establishment figure, approved by the state, taught by professors, celebrated by the church he'd attacked. Every honour betrayed something he'd stood for, yet the work kept generating new readings. Postmodernists found his critique of systematic truth relevant to their scepticism about grand narratives. His emphasis on irony, indirect communication, the impossibility of final interpretation, all of it resonated with deconstructive approaches. Jacques Derrida wrote about him. Gilles Deleuze engaged with repetition. The pseudonyms became examples of how texts exceed authorial control. Religious thinkers kept returning to him, but from different angles. Process theologians used his critique of Hegelian necessity to support their view of an open future. Radical theologians appreciated his attack on religious certainty. Contemplatives found wisdom in his emphasis on inwardness and subjective truth. Each group claimed him while ignoring parts that didn't fit. The anxiety analysis proved remarkably durable. As psychology moved beyond Freud toward cognitive and existential approaches, Kierkegaard's phenomenology of dread looked more sophisticated than it had seemed. He distinguished anxiety from fear, connected it to freedom and possibility, shown how it revealed human nature. Modern anxiety research confirmed much of what he'd intuited. His critique of mass society felt prophetic in the age of mass media and social networks. The crowd that levels everyone down, the public that exists only as abstraction, the loss of individual responsibility when everyone thinks like everyone else. These warnings seemed written for the 20th century, not the 19th. When people worried about conformity in the 1950s, or alienation in the 1960s, or digital tribalism today, they were describing phenomena Kierkegaard had diagnosed. The three stages remained influential as a developmental model. Not everyone accepted them as Kierkegaard presented them, but the idea of movement from aesthetic immediacy through ethical commitment to religious transcendence mapped recognizable patterns. Psychologists used modified versions. Spiritual writers adapted them. The structure provided a way to think about growth, maturation, transformation. But did people actually change how they lived because of reading him? That was always the question. Kierkegaard didn't want admirers. He wanted readers who would close the book and choose differently. Most academic engagement missed that point entirely. Brilliant analyses of his pseudonymous technique or his critique of Hegel didn't necessarily lead to anyone existing with more passion or faith. The work could be appreciated aesthetically, studied historically, analysed philosophically, all while leaving the reader's actual life untouched. Some readers did report transformation. Not many wrote about it because the experience was precisely what Kierkegaard said couldn't be communicated directly. But letters and journals occasionally reveal someone encountering the work and recognising themselves in the descriptions of despair or the aesthetic life or the impossibility of faith. These readers found the books doing what Kierkegaard hoped they would, serving as mirrors that showed you what you were actually doing when you claimed to believe or love or exist. His challenge to Christianity remained uncomfortable. Churches that honoured him often ignored what he'd actually said. Comfortable congregations quoted him in sermons while exemplifying exactly the Christendom he'd attacked. The problem he'd identified, faith as cultural inheritance rather than personal choice, didn't go away. If anything, it got worse in places where Christianity lost cultural dominance. Now you could be culturally Christian without even attending church, just vaguely believing in being nice and thinking Jesus was probably a good guy. The existential framework he'd helped create eventually became its own kind of orthodoxy. You could be an existentialist the way earlier generations had been Hegelians, learning the vocabulary, mastering the concepts, writing papers, without the philosophy transforming how you actually existed. The same problem, different content. What survives? 25 volumes of published work, 25 volumes of journals and papers. Thousands of pages that remain difficult, brilliant, frustrating, profound. They still resist summary. They still provoke argument. They still show readers things about themselves they'd rather not see. The story matters too. The weird childhood, the broken engagement, the public humiliation, the lonely work, the attack on the church, the early death. It's a narrative that makes the philosophy feel lived rather than theoretical. Whether that's fair to Regine or accurate about his actual motivations becomes almost beside the point. The myth serves a function. What Kierkegaard offered, what he still offers, is permission to take your own existence seriously, not as an example of universal laws or a data point in a system, but as yours, unique, requiring choice, demanding commitment. He showed that the gap between what you claim and what you do matters absolutely. He insisted that easy answers were usually wrong. That difficulty might be exactly what you need, that the crowd would always hate anyone who refused to go along. The question he kept asking was never answered. What does it mean to exist as a Christian in Christendom, as an individual in the crowd, as someone responsible for choices in a world that wants to eliminate responsibility? These questions don't resolve. They recur. Each generation has to answer them again, in their own context, through their own choices. That's why the books don't die. Not because they're perfect or because Kierkegaard was right about everything, but because they keep asking questions that won't go away. As long as people claim to believe things they don't really believe, love people they don't really love, exist in ways that aren't really existing, there's work for these texts to do. They'll keep showing readers the gap between claims and reality, keep demanding that you choose what you actually want, keep insisting that following through might cost you everything. The man who died alone in a hospital bed in 1855, estranged from the church, mocked by the public, certain he'd failed, had done exactly what he set out to do. He'd made it impossible to be comfortable. The books ensure that anyone who reads them carefully has to confront what they're actually doing with their life. That was always the point. Not to create a system, but to destroy the ones that let you hide. Not to provide answers, but to sharpen the questions until they became unavoidable. Kierkegaard's Copenhagen is gone. The streets he walked, the churches he attacked, the coffee houses where he argued, all transformed or demolished. But the challenge he issued remains as urgent as it was in 1855. Choose what you actually believe. Live like it matters. Accept that the crowd will hate you for it. And if you claim to follow Christ, understand that it will cost you everything, that it's supposed to be difficult, that comfort is probably a sign you're doing it wrong. That message never gets old because people always need to hear it. The specific targets change. The fundamental evasion stays the same. We still prefer systems to choices, crowds to individuality, easy Christianity to the difficult kind. Kierkegaard saw through all of it. The books preserve his vision for anyone willing to look. So here we are, 170 years after his death, still arguing about what he meant, still trying to pin him down, still doing exactly what he warned against. The academic industry that's grown around him would have made him furious. Conferences dedicated to passing his pseudonyms, peer-reviewed journals analysing his rhetoric, professors building careers on interpretations of interpretations. All of it missing the point spectacularly. He didn't write to be studied. He wrote to make you stop studying and start choosing. But maybe that's inevitable. Maybe every radical voice gets absorbed, domesticated, turned into curriculum. The man who attacked the system becomes part of it. The thinker who insisted on individual choice becomes required reading. The writer who used pseudonyms to avoid authority gets cited as one. There's no escaping the irony. Kierkegaard lives on precisely because we keep doing what he said we shouldn't. We want the comfort of expertise, the safety of knowing what the difficult Danish writer really meant. We want someone else to have figured it out, so we don't have to struggle with it ourselves. The books won't let you off that easily. They're designed not to. Pick up either or and you're not getting a philosophy treatise you can agree or disagree with. You're getting a confrontation with how you actually spend your days, what you actually care about when no one's watching. The aesthete's despair isn't some historical curiosity. It's the shape of scrolling through your phone at 3 a.m. The feeling of trying another distraction because the last one stopped working. Fear and Trembling doesn't explain faith. It shows you how strange it actually is, how far removed from anything we usually call belief. Abraham with the knife raised. No explanation possible, no moral framework that makes it okay, just obedience to something beyond comprehension. That's not comforting. It's not supposed to be. The sickness. Unto death maps territory most people don't want to acknowledge exists. The possibility that you're in despair right now, living it, breathing it, while thinking you're fine. That success and happiness and doing everything right might be evidence of the deepest problem. That the self you think you are might be exactly what's preventing you from becoming who you actually are. These aren't ideas you learn. They're mirrors you look into and either recognize yourself or turn away. Most people turn away. That's fine. Kierkegard never expected otherwise. He knew most readers would take what they could use, ignore the rest, go back to their lives essentially unchanged. But some wouldn't. Some would see themselves in the analysis of anxiety, or the critique of crowd thinking, or the description of aesthetic despair. And for those people, the books do what he wanted them to do. They create the crisis that forces choice. They make comfortable Christianity impossible. They show you the gap between what you claim to believe and what you actually do. That's his legacy. Not the academic influence or the philosophical movements or the prestigious place in intellectual history. Those matter sure, but they're not what he was aiming for. His legacy is the permanent challenge to authenticity, the voice that won't let you rest in easy answers, the insistence that if you're going to claim something, you'd better be willing to live like it's true. The Danish church buried him with all the ceremony he'd spent his final year attacking. The establishment claimed him as soon as he couldn't object. Within a generation, they'd forgotten what he'd said, turned him into a respected figure, made him safe. But the books remain dangerous. They still are. You can't fully domesticate something that's designed to resist domestication. The pseudonyms prevent simple identification. The indirect communication forces you to do the work yourself. The refusal to build a system means there's no finished product to accept or reject. What you're left with is questions, uncomfortable ones. Are you actually living what you claim to believe? Is your faith something you do or just something you inherited? Are you choosing your life or just following scripts other people wrote? Do you exist as yourself or as what the crowd expects? These questions don't have answers you can look up. They require you to choose, to commit, to take responsibility for your own existence. That's terrifying. It's supposed to be. The anxiety Kierkegaard described isn't a disorder to be cured. It's the condition of freedom. The vertigo of standing before infinite possibilities with no one to tell you which one to pick. Most philosophy offers escape from that vertigo. Systems that explain everything. Theories that solve the problem. Kierkegaard offers the opposite. He intensifies the vertigo. He makes the questions sharper, the stakes higher, the cost of choosing clearer. Then he steps back and leaves you there. That's why people keep reading him. Not for comfort or certainty, but because sometimes you need someone to tell you that the difficulty you're feeling isn't a sign you're doing it wrong. Sometimes the difficulty is exactly right. Sometimes the anxiety means you're actually awake, actually choosing, actually alive to the weight of your own existence. The man who walked through Copenhagen in 1846, pants uneven, back hunched, children pointing and laughing, he understood something most people spend their lives avoiding. That being right often means being alone. That truth costs more than most people want to pay. That the crowd will always hate anyone who refuses to pretend along with them. He paid that cost. The broken engagement, the public mockery, the the isolation, the early death. All of it the price of saying what he saw, of refusing to make Christianity comfortable, of insisting that existence demands more than we usually give it. Whether you accept his religious framework or not, whether you believe in the leap of faith or find it absurd, the challenge remains. You're going to die. Before that happens, are you going to exist as yourself or as what everyone expects? Are you going to choose what you actually believe or just go along? Are you going to live like it matters or drift through pretending nothing does? Those questions don't go away. Kierkegaard just articulated them more clearly, more brutally, with more psychological precision than almost anyone before or since. He showed that the problem isn't out there in the world, it's in here, in how you relate to yourself, in whether you're willing to become who you actually are. The books sit on shelves, waiting, not for scholars, though they'll keep coming, not for admirers, though there will be plenty, but for readers who are ready to be confronted, who need someone to tell them that their comfortable life might be the problem, who are willing to consider that everything they've been taught about faith and truth and existence might be exactly what's preventing them from actually believing, actually knowing, actually existing.